All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar today, Evaluating and Managing Wildfire Smoke Impacts During a Pandemic. Today's webinar will be hosted by Forensic Analytical's very own Michelle Rosales and Madeleine Rebullida. Michelle is a certified industrial hygienist and a senior project manager out of our Los Angeles area office. She's a leading expert in FACS's Wildfire and Wildfire Smoke Practice Group and has been working in the environmental health and industrial hygiene field for over 15 years. Michelle is a primary author of AIHA's Technical Guide for Wildfire Impact Assessments for the OEHS professional and has been asked to present at various associations regarding the topic. Madeleine Rebullida is also a project manager for FACS out of our Bay Area office and is also a leader in the FACS Wildfire and Wildfire Smoke Practice Group. Madeleine has worked on many wildfire smoke assessments and is partnering with a variety of clients to train their staff and implement wildfire preparedness plans. Both Michelle and Madeleine are active members in the FACS COVID-19 emergency response team, and they've been implementing COVID-19 safety plans since March of 2020 for over a dozen California municipalities, K-12 schools, and universities. But before I hand it off to them, I'm going to quickly cover a few components of the webinar platform we're using today, GoToWebinar. Everyone is in listen-only mode, but this does not mean that we cannot hear you. As you think of questions that you have for our presenters throughout the webinar, please enter them in the question box in the control panel on your screen you'll see to the right. Choose Send Questions to Staff, and we'll have time for a question and answer session following their presentation. And with that, I'll hand it off to our presenters.
Thank you. Let me move through this a little bit. You already spoke a little bit about us, so I'm going to forward through that. A little bit about who we are. I know that Taylor gave some information, but again, we are an environmental consulting company and we do a wide variety of work, with various industries, both K-12 schools and universities, contractors, commercial buildings. So I think this presentation itself kind of speaks to all different types of groups. So that's why I think it's very important to kind of let you know how we are available for all types of work. So what we're trying to accomplish today with our presentation is to kind of give everyone an understanding of the basic principles of the Cal OSHA emergency standard for wildfire smoke, if you haven't heard about it already. Kind of once you've got that information, how you're going to use these fundamentals that you learn for wildfire preparedness, recovery, and response. What actions are you going to take? Because if you are in California or anywhere on the West Coast, you are not immune at all to wildfires and the impact. Even, if the wildfire is maybe 50 miles away from you, as you've seen, especially in the Bay Area, these fires from hundreds of miles away, depending on wind directions, can impact you. So it's very important that you are prepared and ready to respond as needed. And then along with that, we're in a pandemic. So it's odd because some of the recommendations for wildfire preparedness and trying to improve air quality kind of are not necessarily the same as COVID-19 standards. So understanding how to deal with wildfire smoke during the COVID pandemic, we've got a good amount of information to share with you on the COVID-19 standard itself, and also how you could correlate it with your wildfire smoke preparedness plan. And then ultimately at the end, we want to make sure that you can walk away with techniques to protect yourself and fellow coworkers. So this doesn't only just deal with the workplace, but kind of some information that you can take home to your loved ones. So when talking about wildfire smoke, the first thing we want to talk about is what is it composed of? What are we being actually exposed to? Well, wildfire smoke is the components of the wildfire smoke are dependent on the fuel source and also the conditions of combustion. So people generally think it's just particulates are in the air because that's what we're seeing during wildfire events. But smoke is a colloidal mix of gases and vapors and liquids and particulates. So depending on what burns, we can have an array of volatile organic compounds that are being generated, aldehydes such as formaldehyde, which is a carcinogen, carbon monoxide, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, you name it. So there's a big wide range of things that can be generated during a wildfire event. However, typically when we're talking about public health, and generally when we're trying to evaluate worker exposure or just general air quality in neighboring communities, we're looking at the particulate matter. So we're looking at, typically we're looking at the particulate matter that's the 10 micron size diameter or less, or the 2.5 micron diameter or less. So these are the ones that can get inhaled. So greater than 10 can, maybe get caught up in the nose area. It doesn't necessarily reach your lungs because it's large enough that it's being stopped. It still can irritate eyes. It can still cause irritation of nose and throats. Doesn't mean it's not an issue. But what we're truly worried about is the smaller size particulate that can be inhaled and can get into the lungs or even get into the bloodstream. So the PM 2.5, which you'll hear a lot about later on, especially when we're talking about the Cal OSHA standard, this is that fine particulate matter that we're most concerned about. And again, although we have all that other stuff, we know that this is what's generally, will always be produced, and it's something that's generally wind driven. And that is not just within the fire vicinity itself, but hundreds of miles away. Something that's light enough to go up in the air and then eventually heavy enough to settle onto surfaces. So I'm going to begin with talking about the Cal OSHA regulations and some of the guidelines that are available. We have the Cal OSHA emergency standard, which is 5141.1, which is the protection for wildfire smoke, and that's the emergency standard that will provide specific recommendations and guidelines that have to be adhered to during wildfire events. Also, very importantly, is the protecting indoor workplaces from wildfire smoke with building ventilation system guidelines that are generated for general improvement. And there are two other guidelines that are available that we really won't be talking about today, because when I think about wildfires, the emergency standard and the protecting the indoor worker kind of goes interchangeably. So I'm going to be talking about those together because, again, the whole point is trying to improve worker health and preventing exposures to the extent possible. And the other two are kind of regarding the cleanup, which again is very important as well, but not necessarily something I'm going to be discussing today. It probably deserves its own presentation. So the emergency standard came into play in July 29, 2019. And typically, if you're not aware, when you have an emergency standard, it usually have about a year before they make it a permanent regulation. That's because they're doing, people are making revisions or making comments to it and discussing a little bit further. With the pandemic and other things on the mind, it's been extended, so it's still in the emergency standard mode. Who it applies to, it's when there is a wildfire smoke event and there's reason to believe that the employees may be exposed to that wildfire smoke. And also whenever the AQI value for the PM 2.5 is greater than 151. So again, if you remember a couple slides back, that's the particulate matter, the fine particulate matter that's small enough to be inhaled and get into the lungs and potentially into the bloodstream. So later in the presentation, I'll go over AQI, the air quality index, and all the different things that they look at with that. But when we're talking about the wildfire regulations itself, we're just looking at that PM 2.5, and we're not looking at the other pollutants that are generally represented in AQI levels or values. So what does the emergency regulation require? Well, it requires that you identify the harmful exposures. So identifying where there's a potential for this person to be exposed to that. It also requires a communication, trying to relay that information to others, because what I didn't say in the last slide was that there are some that are exempt from that. So if you are in a enclosed structure, such as a building, with a mechanical system that is filtering air, you are exempt. If you are in a vehicle, a truck, or car that has the same thing where it has a filtration system and it's closed, you are exempt. Firefighters are exempt, and if the AQI is greater than 151 for an hour or less, you're exempt. If not, you have to follow the emergency regulation. So if you are in a building that does not have a forced air system, although you're indoors, you must adhere to this regulation. And I think that's a big misconception about the regulations, that people just assume it's an outside worker, and it's not. It's only exempt for those who can filter the air and pretty much control the level of exposure of the outdoor contaminant from coming indoors. So back to the requirements. It also requires a training and instruction information, so kind of the hazard communication aspect. So letting workers know that what are they being exposed to, how they can protect themselves, how their employer is helping protect them, and other, medical requirements and health effects associated with it. So the general HazCom portion. And then also it talks about controlling of harmful exposures. So you have to kind of identify how are you going to try to control exposures. So just like all industrial hygiene, we have our hierarchy of control. So isolation, can we remove the worker from the space, right? Can we not have them working outdoors or not working at that point? If that is impossible, what are other things to do? We have the engineering controls, which we always like, but again, if someone's outdoors, putting a portable HEPA filtration device outdoors next to them is not, obviously, it doesn't make sense, it can't happen. But they talk about the respiratory protection a lot in the regulation. And again, although that's our kind of last line defense, they do outline that if the AQI value is between the 151 and 500 for that PM 2.5 particulate, that the employer must provide that employee a NIOSH approved particulate respirator, such as an N95. But this is on a voluntary basis, so encouraging the use of it, having it available for everyone. And that's where the COVID pandemic will kind of cause a little issues with that, and Madeleine will go into more detail about that, but that is part of the standard. And also, if you get to a level greater than 500 of an AQI value, and if you've ever been actually in the environment with a AQI value of greater than 500, you will definitely know that it is now a requirement. I mean, this is when it's like full-on Dust Bowl type situation. And now the employer must provide and require that employee to use the NIOSH approved particulate respirator. So now we're getting into respiratory protection programs and everything associated with that. So it's important to be prepared for this, because wildfires do not give us advance warning. I mean, I guess you used to say it could, because we had a wildfire season, or we knew, like in the Southern California, we had Santa Ana winds. But now, if you the last couple of years, I'm sure you're aware that it comes without warning. Our wildfire season is no longer like a 6 months. It's now pretty much throughout the year. And it doesn't matter if it's windy or if it's not windy or hot or cold, it's just, they come. So being prepared for this is very important, because if you know there's workers and you know that you cannot control certain aspects, maybe you're in public safety or maybe in the telecommunications industries, you know that you know, and you should be prepared that this is going to happen, and you want to make sure that your employees are ready and you have the right supplies and equipment available for them. And that's where we come into minimizing impact. And this is kind of goes hand in hand with the protecting the indoor worker, because again, maybe you're thinking, okay, well, I'm working in a school, so we're going to be in an indoor environment, so this really isn't too applicable to us when we're thinking about the regulations. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be prepared and you shouldn't have something available on hand. So if we want to minimize impact, we have to have a preparedness section available, a response and recovery, preparing beforehand before the wildfire event, kind of outlining how we're going to respond, and then in terms of recovery, what we're going to be doing. So in order to do that, we should prepare by having a written plan in place. And what I call it is a wildfire preparedness plan, or wildfire preparedness recovery response plan, but similar to what we have already for earthquakes, especially in Southern California or California in general. Everybody pretty much has an earthquake plan available, but do they have wildfire plans? And as we know, those are occurring more often than earthquakes. So being prepared and having this document created to know exactly what's going to happen, a chain of command, who's going to be responsible for what? Are we already training our employees to know what they're supposed to be doing in the event of a wildfire? Are we prepared HVAC-wise? Do we have the correct filters, or do we know what filter efficiency we have? Because if we have MERV 8s, can our system have a higher efficiency filter put in there that we install when we know that there is potential exposures to wildfires or a wildfire nearby that may impact the air quality? Also, a supply and inventory list, because when the wildfire hits, you better believe everybody's looking for portable air filtration devices. So we want to make sure that you maybe already own some, or you have a vendor available that you typically work with to supply that. Maybe other cleaning products, other things of that nature. And also contact information of these individuals. I wrote a wildfire preparedness plan for a supermarket up in the Northwest, and it was very detailed down to, we're going to need sticky mats. This is the exact type, a link to it, the type we want. Here is the vendor that we're going to have, and this is how many we're going to have. Same thing with the air filtration devices. It was a floor plan of the facility, exactly where these are going to be loaded, strategically figuring out where they're going to be, what doors are going to be shut, all of these things already in the preparedness. So when it occurs, there's no questions, there's no freaking out. It's like, oh, here we go. We're on to doing exactly what we need to do. And including in that plan, we also need to think about evacuation plans because it's no longer wildfires burning in forests, it's now hitting communities. So depending on where you're located, you want to identify if you think this is if you think this is necessary, an evacuation plan, looking at the landscape, how can we make ourselves less likely to, actually have the wildfire hit our structure? So are we looking at the landscape around our building? A chemical inventory, if by chance a fire does come and it hits your property, do you have a chemical inventory available so you can give emergency responders, the firefighters, so they know what they're walking into? Because if you have a facility that maybe stores a certain number of chemicals or a certain, a large amount of some funky stuff here and there, you want to make sure that you know where it's located and how much of it you have, so that you have that information available to provide to firefighters who may be walking into an environment that they have no idea what they're walking into. And then the human resource aspect, and this has to do with not only if your building is burning down, but also just we're seeing a lot more the emotional impact that wildfires have. Having to go to work not knowing if your home is going to burn down puts a toll on people. And it's important to have that human resources portion also implemented into the plan, understanding that people may not be able to even get to work, or they may have to work from home, and just the human side to it is very important, and putting that into your preparedness to understand that maybe people are going to have days off, or maybe we need to talk about mental health. That all needs to be discussed beforehand in your preparedness plan. So here's a nice photo from the National Fire Protection Association that kind of talks about the landscape issue and, the immediate zone, the extended zone of what you should be thinking about in terms of making sure that your area or your building is less susceptible to, catching on fire. I know one thing I learned was mulch around your house is not a good idea. I think it was a firewise.org website, but it showed videos of how quick something can catch on fire when you have things like that. They're just like, fuel sources. So kind of, if you know that you're in an area, a high fire area, looking at websites like this to kind of identify how you can kind of protect yourself a little bit better, it is great to think about before a wildfire event. So once the wildfire hits, what is our response going to be? So again, as I stated, we know that smoke is composed of so many different contaminants, but from a public health aspect, we're typically looking at that PM 2.5 and PM 10, the stuff that can get into your respiratory system and eventually, potentially, into your bloodstream. And we also know that there's other things like potential carcinogens such as a formaldehyde. So we need to know this, and this has to be a part of the trainings for individuals so that they're aware of it, what they're going to be looking for and potentially monitoring for both the standard itself, the regulations, and also for, again, just improving air quality into a workspace. And here's another photo just to kind of put in perspective how small the PM 2.5 is. And I love this slide too, because I like to show how the human hair is 50 to 70 microns in diameter, and see how, that one little strand, how small it is, and think about PM 2.5. So this is really, really small, something not really visible to the eye. And this is what we're looking at. And this is what we want to make sure that we're controlling the exposures to and evaluating for both the emergency regulations and also just for, indoor air quality itself. So as I stated, we're looking at the air quality index when we're trying to evaluate potential public health and exposures to wildfire. So the websites that you can go through are US EPA Now, Forestry, AQMD. There's several different, local air quality management districts that will provide information. But on a daily basis, they're giving you numbers, and the pollutants that they look at on a daily basis are the PM10, PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. And these are all produced during wildfires. But again, when we're looking at the emergency regulation, we're looking at just the PM 2.5 data. And it's important to know when we're looking at the PM 2.5 data, the AQI value is not specific to a true concentration. It is a value that's been calculated by a true concentration. So the 151 level is considered the unhealthy level. So that's about a 55.5 micron per cubic meter, microgram per cubic meter concentration to about 150 microgram per cubic meter concentration. So already this is in the unhealthy level. So again, you can obtain this data from various sites. Purple air, if you've heard of it or haven't heard of it, is kind of a monitoring system for the general public. And they're not monitors that are perfect, or not even perfect, or they're not as good of a monitor as the ones through the websites, but they do provide useful information. But if you're going to be looking at numbers for the regulation itself, you need to obtain your data through these reputable sites, such as, again, your local air quality management district or California Air Resource Board. And there are, especially during wildfire events or large wildfire events, they will put out more monitors. CARB, the California Air Resource Board, will put out more monitors just to monitor the areas. Because if you've ever looked on the website to see how many monitors are placed throughout your state, you'll be surprised that there really aren't as many as you think they are. A lot of the values that they provide in the AQI are based on forecasting. They're based on just, the terrain, wind direction. So they'll take data from one location and kind of extrapolate that to other areas. So which is one good thing about the purple areas is that you can see, throughout, closer locations to that space. But again, you cannot use that in terms of comparing to the regulations. In the response portion of when the wildfire is hitting, we need to make sure that that evacuation plan is being implemented if necessary and the fire is near your area. We need to communicate, as always, communicate with people, let them know what's going on, what are the steps we're taking. We're going to put into place all the items we prepared for, making sure those HVAC modifications are in place. So in a wildfire event, we want to shut the outdoor air intakes. We want to make sure that we're not allowing that what we used to call fresh outdoor air, which is no longer fresh, from coming in. We want to reduce entry locations. So if we have a building where there's 10 entries, we want to reduce that, maybe have 2 locations for entry and exit to try to reduce the outdoor air from entering this space to the extent possible. And we want to start putting out those supplies and equipment that we prepared for and the locations that we prepared to put them in so that we're trying to reduce to the extent possible the amount of wildfire smoke from entering the space itself. So again, controlling the air from entering. So if we can shut out the fresh outdoor air intakes, let's do that. Maybe carbon dioxide levels go out because that's what's exhaled by individuals, but again, we're outweighing the hazards here, and I would rather have higher higher levels of carbon dioxide and maybe stuffiness versus wildfire particulates from entering the space. And if we cannot shut the outdoor air intakes, maybe placing those higher efficiency filters in your system, if your system is able to withstand that increased pressure. And again, that's why you have to prepare it beforehand to ensure that you've had your system looked at, it's regularly maintained, and it's it has the capability for you to put those filters in there, because we don't want to throw MERV 14 filters in there and your system breaks down. So that would obviously be a bad thing. And again, limiting the access to the space. Sticky mats is one thing people do sometimes, because again, we're tracing the part, the ash and the char maybe settling down on surfaces, and you may be bringing it in with your shoes. So near the entry points, putting those down to reduce anything from coming in, even maybe the wind bringing it in at lower levels. And if you've ever, been in an occupied building during a wildfire event, you'll see a lot of the particulate generally is right around the entryway of the building. So trying to limit that with sticky mats is best. And then continual cleaning efforts using high efficiency vacuums, damp wiping. We don't want to dust, because obviously dusting just puts the particulate back in the air and it makes it airborne and potential exposure issues to individuals. And again, just if you have the availability, have portable HEPA filtered air handling units, put that in there. And then after the fire, what do you plan on doing? We want to make sure that we're continually cleaning, because after a wildfire event, the particulate doesn't stop. And if you've been, again, near a large wildfire event, you know that for a long periods of time, when the winds come, they may pick back up the dust and eventually, get it into your spaces. So it's important that you're continually cleaning, regrouping, kind of discussing what you've been doing so far. Is it working? Do we need to add additional controls? If not, if it's working, maybe we open up a new door entry, kind of regrouping and finding out what are your next steps. And depending on your location, maybe you want some form of post-cleaning assessment. If it's a population that's deemed sensitive, maybe a healthcare facility or a school, maybe you want to determine whether or not you need a post-cleaning assessment performed. And that can include sensory observation. Do we visibly see smoke particulate? Do we smell? An olfactory investigation? Maybe some form of air sampling. There really is no standard to compare indoor air to PM 2.5, but we can look at the AQI values and kind of use that as a basis for whether or not the space is cleaned appropriately or adequately. And then surface sampling, are we finding, higher than background levels of smoke particulate in an indoor environment? And once we kind of feel comfortable, then we can begin our full services again and try to go back to normalcy to the extent possible. And again, there's a lot of sensory observations. I know people love sampling, but it's always important to know that sampling only gives us one piece of the puzzle. Our sensory investigation is probably the most important, especially when we're dealing with wildfire smoke and the impact of that. So, walking around, if we still smell it, it's an issue, and we need to try to identify that and eradicate that to the extent possible. And now we're going to talk about the OSHA regulations during pandemic operations and how that kind of correlates with both the worker safety for COVID, but also during wildfire events. There you go, Madeleine.
Yeah. All right. So like Michelle was saying, there's been a little bit of a delay in enforcement of the emergency standard for the wildfires, obviously because of the pandemic, and a lot of the concerns that impact exposure to COVID have an overlap or a contradiction with how we would manage the exposure to wildfire smoke and some of the different hazards associated with wildfires. So OSHA recently put out a COVID-19 prevention standard. It's 3205. And this is one that is for all employers. It does not include people who work from home or healthcare workers. Healthcare workers are covered under a different section, and there's specific guidance for them as far as managing their exposure to different hazards. It does require that you have a written program. So they indicate that that written program should be an amendment to your IIPP, your Injury and Illness Prevention Program. The IIPP is a existing Cal OSHA requirement for all employers, and it just details how you're managing all the different health and safety aspects for your workforce. So the COVID-19 prevention standard is considered to be an addendum to that. It also talks about how to manage multiple COVID-19 infections and outbreaks. And then it has two sections on housing and worker or employer provided transportation to and from work. So within this standard, it does talk about ventilation and filtration, and it does provide some basic guidance on those things, but in the large part, it references other groups like the CDC or ASHRAE. ASHRAE is it's an industry organization that sets all sorts of standards for building systems like ventilation, heating, cooling, water systems, and they have a couple really good comprehensive documents about what their recommendations are for how you should configure your HVAC systems in buildings to prevent the exposure to infectious aerosols. And then there's a link on here, and I believe you guys are getting the slides as well, so you can look at these on your own. They have like a little one-page, their basic guidance on how to set up ventilation and filtration during pandemic operations. There's also the Harvard School of Public Health document, which has a lot of information in it for schools. Recently, California CDPH and the Office of Education put together a consolidated document that had all of the schools' guidance in it. So I don't know if you have been, I mean, the COVID stuff has been changing every like 3 months. We're getting new guidance on it. And it's like, you know, I feel like we're getting whiplash just trying to meet all of these different standards, because as consultants, we're writing these health and safety plans. And then as soon as we plow through writing them and they make sense and we start implementing, we get new guidance. And the school's guidance was kind of all over the map. And the new consolidated document very specifically calls out ASHRAE and these documents. And it talks in a lot more detail about ventilation and filtration in schools. So if you recall what Michelle was saying about the wildfire guidance, you know, we want to prevent the air from entering the building. Well, the guidance is totally different for COVID. We want to get in as much ventilation as possible, as much fresh air as possible. So there's some basic approaches to HVAC guidance within these documents, and they center around ventilation, filtration, and then portable HEPA units. So I wanted to put together sort of a consolidated snapshot of what those guidance pieces look like. So for ventilation, as much fresh air as possible, open the windows, open the doors. One thing that Cal OSHA regulation specifically states is when we can shut windows and doors, because that was a big question. I've been working with schools and we're saying, open all the windows and open all the doors, get in all the fresh air. Well, it's like 30 degrees in the morning where some of these schools are, and the kids are really cold. Or there's a wildfire, right? And now we've got to deal with an AQI over 100 or 151. And how does that impact it? So thankfully, Cal OSHA put some specific parameters in place. And they said that you can close the windows and doors if the temperature is below 60 or over 90, if it's raining or snowing and that's presenting an additional hazard, or if the AQI is over 100. And again, that's looking at your EPA Air Now or your California Air Resources Board or your AQMD. Once those windows and doors are closed, though, we need to still manage some level of filtration. So installing MERV 13 rated filters is definitely recommended. That's also going to be helpful come wildfire smoke time, because you're going to have enhanced filtration on your units there. NAFA, which is the National Air Filtration Association, there's a hyperlink in there, and they'll give you a lot of information about what a MERV rating is and what that means. But if you can target that MERV 13 range, that's the ideal, and that's what's called out in the document. There's other considerations with that, though, and Michelle kind of talked about it. You know, not every air handling unit can handle the increased demand when you add in enhanced filtration. So you're essentially making like a little smaller place for the air to go through, and it can cause maintenance issues or additional wear and tear on your equipment. So it's just something to think about. You're also going to be consuming more energy, so you're looking at a higher electric bill. So if enhanced filtration isn't a great option, or you don't have a forced air system, you don't have a mechanical ventilation system, portable HEPA units are a good alternative. Buyer beware. There's a lot of, these are really popular now. Everyone's getting these little desktop air filter units, and there's specific guidance on, you know, what is the most appropriate HEPA unit for the space and for what you're trying to control. And it has to do with the CADR rating, and that's centered around sizing. You want to think about whether or not it generates ozone. We don't want to have ozone in our buildings. It creates an additional hazard. It can cause headaches and nausea, and it has a little bit of an odor, but it's largely imperceptible until it becomes a problem. So make sure that the unit is not ozone generating, and think about where you're going to place it in the room. Is it a large enough size to accommodate the square footage of the room? If it is a smaller unit, you know, putting it on the floor somewhere may not be the most beneficial. So there's a lot of good guidance on that ASHRAE site, and there's links to seeing a list of approved units. So this is a really great comprehensive document. It's not super long. It's from the EPA, and it talks about how to choose the best air cleaner for your house. This is also something that's beneficial come wildfire smoke season as well. It also will, if you're choosing the appropriate filter size and the CADR rating for your room, it's going to help to pull some allergens out of the air. So if you have seasonal allergies, it's something that I have in my house and I would always recommend. But just make sure that you're choosing the correct unit for the space that you have. The other thing that's changed a little bit with COVID is all of the cleaning and disinfection. So if you recall way at the beginning of this, everybody was like spraying everything down, hand sanitizer everywhere, disinfecting multiple times throughout the day. And what we've come to discover as more and more data comes out about how this disease is transmitted is that surface transmission is considered to be a very unlikely form of transmission, because as everybody knows, and I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about this, but COVID is transmitted through the air, through respiratory droplets or through aerosols, which are also called droplet nuclei. And those aerosols, remember that PM 2.5? Those droplet nuclei are really, really small, and they can hang in the air for a long period of time. For surface transmission to happen, someone would have to be shedding the virus. So I cough or sneeze, or I'm breathing all over this surface, and then you come and you touch it, and then you touch your eye or your mouth, or put your hand in your nose, and then that's how that transmission would work. But it really does depend on there being enough viral load in the droplet or the aerosol that deposited on that surface, the amount of time it was on the surface, the type of surface it was. So all of that extra cleaning, I saw an article the other day that called it hygiene theater, which I thought was kind of funny, because it does make us feel better. It's really tangible. Like Michelle was saying, 2.5, you can't see it with your naked eye. You can't see aerosols. You can't see COVID in the air. It doesn't make you turn bright purple when you come in contact with it. So being able to clean stuff is like a really tangible physical reminder of like, okay, we're doing something productive here. But what the new the consolidated schools guidance says is that they're not recommending multiple disinfection throughout the day. They only recommend disinfection of surfaces if there's been a confirmed case. So the difference between cleaning and disinfecting is pretty important, right? Cleaning is when you're just wiping, removing debris or stains or marks from a surface, and you're using a cleaning product. Disinfecting is when you're using a specific product to remove or kill a specific type of organism. EPA has a list N, and if you go to it, it's constantly being updated, and there's hundreds of thousands of products on there. But every one of those products has been proven to be effective against the virus that causes COVID-19. So if you are going to be disinfecting, you want to make sure you're using one of those products. What the Consolidated Schools guidance also says is that if you're using those products, make sure you're not then creating an additional hazard. So a chlorine-based product or a citric acid-based product is going to be, it can be irritating to the skin. It could cause issues with your eyes, or if it comes in contact with your eyes, or if if someone ingests it. So make sure that you are using a disinfecting product that is the most appropriate for the environment that you're in. Okay, so another piece that overlaps with the wildfire smoke stuff here is respiratory protection. And if you recall back the slide that Michelle had with I think it was a P100 actually that was up there, and it had a little valve on there. One thing that's come out of this COVID stuff is now all of a sudden everybody's an expert on respirators and has a lot more public understanding and knowledge of what is a respirator and what's the difference between a face mask and a respirator. So an N95 is a NIOSH approved tight fitting filtering face piece respirator. Not to be confused with the KN95, which is manufactured in China. It's a different version. It's not approved by NIOSH. There have been some KN95s that have been evaluated by the FDA and approved for use in medical settings due to the shortage of available NIOSH respirators. But they are two different things, right? OSHA did put out some temporary guidance on strategies for optimizing your inventory of N95s during wildfire smoke events or other respirator shortages. And it says basically that, you can first look at those engineering and administrative controls like Michelle was talking about earlier. Are there ways that we can engineer the environment to improve the air quality without having to put people in respirators? Can we have less people in the building? And those types of administrative controls. Then you can look at using any other available NIOSH certified respirator, like a full face respirator or a P100, or I know they look really scary if you see people walking around in them, but with the 2 cartridges on there, you could use some of those. Those are actually a lot easier to get now than the N95s. Using expired ones is allowed. Non-employer supplied certified respirators. So if the employer doesn't have it, the employee is allowed to bring their own. Limited reuse of respirators, and there's a whole section on the CDC website about how to appropriately reuse and store your respirator. The N95 respirators were always intended to be single-use respirators, but now we have more guidance on how we can extend the life of those given the shortages. And then the last option there is like non-NIOSH approved ones. But that's only if the PM 2.5 is less than 175. All right. So let's put it all together here. Let's look at COVID-19 and how it lines up with wildfire smoke. And this is based on everything we talked about. We talked about guidance documents. We talked about regulations. We talked about industry expertise. We talked about health considerations. So when we're looking at these different controls, the first thing that we'll talk about here is ventilation. So with smoke, we want to reduce outdoor intake, but with COVID, we want to maximize outdoor intake. So during a wildfire smoke event, you'll want to pursue the next step, which is enhanced filtration or one of those portable air units. Access and distancing. So COVID-19, obviously, we know 6 feet distance, manage your social distancing. With a wildfire smoke event, we want to control access to the building. So there is some commonality among those two, that we're trying to reduce the number of people that are in the environment being exposed. And that can be done through restricting entry points or just in general reducing the number of people that are in the building. Outdoor activities, this is like total opposite, right? So the way that a lot of the schools I've been working with have been able to still do athletics and to even teach classes, they have outdoor classrooms, is to put them outside. Well, if it's raining or snowing, or if the AQI is above 100, and that's for schools, but if it's above 151, then now you have to move it indoors. So take into consideration, you want to be able to have those two options. And if you are going to be moving a group indoors because of air quality issues outdoors, make sure that that indoor space has been assessed appropriately for ventilation and distancing. Cleaning and ventilation. So reducing outdoor air ventilation, outdoor air intake is part of the smoke guidance, but you also want to make sure that you're maintaining your systems and you're cleaning your air handler units, that your filters are not expired, that they're being changed according to your protocols. If you are going to conduct cleaning of your ventilation system, that ASHRAE website has a great guidance document on that as well. And for COVID, we talked about the use of disinfectants, but when you are using those disinfectants, you want to ensure that you have adequate ventilation. So for example, with electrostatic cleaning, most of those are chlorine-based or bleach-based, and that can create some harmful vapors in that space. So, keeping the doors and windows open during that, or making sure that you're following all of the PPE requirements and recommendations for the manufacturer of that particular disinfectant. And then outdoor worker protection. So for COVID, respirator supplies are limited. If you're outdoors and you're distanced, you can wear a mask. You don't have to have an N95 respirator. With a wildfire smoke, that's all dependent on the AQI and the type of activity. But just know that Cal OSHA does have a document to assist in making decisions when there are respirator shortages. So this just summarizes how to do that balance, right? Like how do we work with both of these things at the same time? And a big part of it is just understanding, what are the most effective layers of controls, right? So if you can eliminate something from the environment, then that's the most effective thing, right? So people not coming into work. But next step there would be the engineering aspect. And that's where all of those guidance documents come in handy, because the regulatory documents don't provide a lot of specifics when it comes to the engineering controls. Last thing to mention here is that even though healthcare workers are not covered under that Cal OSHA regulation or that Cal OSHA standard, there are some special considerations when it comes to healthcare, obviously with COVID, but also with wildfires. So hospital ventilation systems are well equipped to accommodate enhanced filtration. They're already designed to be providing a specific number of air changes per hour in a space, but making sure that you're able to control the access of the air into the building during a wildfire smoke event is really important. Because once all those particulates start entering and some of those potential carcinogens start entering the space, the area will have to be cleaned before you can be treating patients in there again. And so thinking about, what is the impact to some of the service areas, if there's a limited amount of respirators or a limited amount of HEPA equipment, what are the most critical areas to put those in? And we do have a consolidated guidance document just talking about what are some of the considerations with wildfire smoke in healthcare facilities. I know oftentimes some hospital areas are closed down and evacuated during a wildfire event. And so this document talks a little bit about what can be done to prepare that space to be reopened and to be reopened safely. So final thoughts, Michelle, please feel free to jump in here. But with any good safety plan, the details are important, and those details are supported by a multidisciplinary team. So when she was talking about that grocery store in the Northwest, getting down into all that nitty-gritty, you know, that covered all the areas of logistics, human resources, everything. And it takes all those different pieces to understand, well, how that plan can best be implemented. Because, you know, I work in one area of operations. I may not know what another department specifically needs. So having representatives from across all the different areas within your organization is really important. Plan elements that are specific to areas, operations, and tasks. So that's where that multidisciplinary piece comes in. But, you know, the way that, for example, in a municipality, the way that the public works staff functions is very different from the way that, you know, the permitting department or building inspectors are going to function. And they may need specific things. When it comes to COVID, thinking about what can we do with our public works teams so that we don't lose our entire workforce because they all have to isolate because one person was exposed or became positive. So thinking about how you're setting up those cohort groups. Maybe think about enhanced respiratory protection for some groups so that they can work side by side. There's some things that, depending on the task and the job, requires, you can't socially distance, right? Or you have outdoors during a wildfire event. So make sure that your plan elements are specific to areas, operations, and tasks. Communication is so important. Transparency is so important. With COVID and with wildfire, people take their health very seriously. You know, with the wildfire smoke, not just, you know, oh, I'm personally being impacted, you know, potentially, you know, my respiratory system may be adversely impacted by the air quality, but it's also my entire community may be decimated by this fire. And that's a heavy load to carry. And then to think about the COVID side of it, you know, if I'm working in a high risk environment where I'm having a multiple contact with the public throughout the day, what am I potentially taking home to my family? So there's a lot of anxiety that goes along with that. And much of that can be eliminated through frequent, clear, and transparent communication with your workforce. Make it, you know, all the efforts that you're putting into creating a safety plan are going to be effective, right? And that they're being shared with everyone. People don't know what you're doing unless you tell them. And creating processes to support being adaptable to the ever-changing guidance. You know, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of fluctuation in the wildfire smoke guidance, and Michelle can speak better to that, but for sure, the more that we understand about the COVID thing, the more going to get either contradictory, new, or enhanced guidance. And a lot of that's going to come forward with vaccinations. We don't have clear guidance on what changes in the workforce once we have mass vaccinations, or what is going to change with some of the possible variants and mutations with the virus. So make sure that when your plan is being revised and adapted on some sort of regular frequency.
A living document.
A living document.
Not a document you put in a binder and you put on a shelf. Both the COVID and the wildfire. And again, I agree, wildfire may not necessarily change often, but COVID changed it. So if you had prepared a wildfire preparedness plan, that had to be adjusted for COVID. So regardless if it changes monthly like COVID, it's always important to have a living document that's constantly thought of, reviewed by at least one party to kind of identify any changes and ways to protect your workers. So agreed.
Yeah, and one last thing I wanted to add too was that, you know, I'm sure that some of the building and facilities managers that are on this webinar right now are like, you know, spinning their wheels a little bit, thinking about like, how we're going to make all these upgrades. Is our system correct? Or, you know, some of the risk managers that might be on the call. So as industrial hygienists, we can provide a lot of insight on how to interpret the guidance documents, how to write safety plans, how to make sure you're in compliance with regulations. But I would highly recommend also contacting an HVAC engineering expert. And these are people that can come out and measure the airflow of your systems and do a really detailed assessment. We can do assessments and provide some recommendations, but being able to work hand in hand with those people, or your on-site HVAC expert is the best way to go about doing one of those assessments.
Perfect.
Great. And we've had several questions come in. Are you guys ready for a Q&A session?
Go ahead.
I'm ready. Oh yeah.
Perfect. The first one's a little lengthy. I work for an electric utility, and we have to protect employees from arc flash hazards when they are working within the minimum approach distance, MAD. Respiration often has to occur during wildfire events. Do you know of any fire-resistant N95s that are on the market which would allow employees to protect themselves against both hazards during wildfire events? Are there enough of a variety that would allow them to be fit tested if AQI is above 500?
I do not know of any of an N95 that would be fire protected. And if you're that close to the fire, I think it's important to know that the N95 isn't appropriate because, again, as I stated, fire could be full of gases and vapors as well. So if you're going to be in close proximity to a fire, you're going to have to be wearing higher efficiency respirators, such as like a full phase with organic vapor cartridges, as well as the P100s, etc. So that would have to be evaluated a little bit differently, and the N95 would not be appropriate.
Okay. Our next question, can you discuss the effectiveness of workers wearing N95s for smoke and COVID? OSHA does not consider cloth face coverings to be PPE.
Yeah, face coverings are not considered personal protective equipment. So we have to make sure we're distinguishing the face covering versus a respirator. So the respirator, again, stating the NIOSH certified respirator, is a form of personal protective equipment, but the face covering is not. And I don't know if we have enough time to go into the effectiveness of a face covering for COVID. For wildfire smoke, it's not considered. It's not a part of the regulation at all. They're talking about respirators. And again, if you're going above the 500, it's respirators that someone has been fit tested for, someone that's been medically evaluated within a respiratory protection program, etc. So that's a different form.
Okay, great. And then a follow-up.
Oh,
Go
one
ahead,
second.
Madeleine.
That's an important distinction that since we're talking about injury and illness prevention plans and safety plans in general, and the COVID safety plan being an addendum to that, or your wildfire smoke preparedness plan also being an addendum to that, if you are requiring your employees to wear a respirator for the specific purpose of respiratory protection, they are required to be fit tested and then be part of a written respiratory protection program and have some sort of medical surveillance. So fit testing, make sure that the respirator fits well. But the medical surveillance piece is really important because you need to be medically fit to wear a respirator. If you're going to be wearing a respirator for an 8-hour workday, it requires a little bit more demand on your respiratory system, and you have to do a spirometry test and everything for that. I will point out too, we didn't talk about face shields, but CDPH and OSHA do consider face shields to be PPE because they provide the eye protection, but they are not a substitute for a face covering or a respirator. Face covering, CDPH, go to their website, California Department of Public Health, they have their statement on face coverings and respirators for use for COVID-19. And it says what's approved, what's not, what's appropriate, what's not, and what certain levels of protection are. The face covering, if you're going to make a choice, the one that's recommended is a 3-layer paper mask. And then it'll give you some more details on that in the CDPH document.
Great. And then as a comment to the first question about a flame-resistant respirator, it sounds like there's a 3M flame-resistant 8515 particulate welding respirator N95. So thank you for whoever commented that. The next question, for COVID, do you have a good resource on ideal location or placement for portable HEPA units?
In that EPA document, I can give you a link to, because it does talk about where to place it in the room. So it really just depends on the size of the room, how it's being used, and where their windows are, if there are windows, and any kind of supply or return air vents that might already be in the space. But also the unit you purchase often comes with recommendations on placement as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of considerations to take place. It's not a exact science to just say you put it in the center of the room. I think that's very important, is that you need to look at your situation, assess what you're trying to accomplish with that portable air filtration device, and identify its specific location based on the parameters in your room.
Yeah, and think about, this is your breathing zone, right? Like 10 to 8 inches around your nose and your mouth. And if you're taking into consideration all of the other elements of filtration and ventilation in the space and how you're moving in the space, that can help to guide some of that. But intuitively, you would know, like, putting it on the floor under your desk is not going to be helpful.
Great. Our next question is, since COVID-19 requirements have moved employers to have employees work from home, does the Cal OSHA regulation apply to home workplaces? No, it does not, thankfully. Can you imagine if you were an employer and you were responsible for the managing all the hazards in your employees' homes? That would be so terrifying. But no, it does not apply to people working from home.
But a portion of the program is identifying the hazards and how you plan on controlling them. And one of the controls would be having employees that have the ability to work from home. Doesn't mean you're not making sure that their space is safe. It's that you're removing them from your work area as a form of a control, because they may be exposed to other individuals outside their household.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where it's a little tricky, because we can't control what people do in their personal lives or what they do out in public when they're not in the work building, right? And a lot of the COVID stuff is behaviors. So one thing that we do recommend is that even though someone's working from home, I still want them to let me know if they develop symptoms or if they have had an exposure, because it is going to impact their work. And even though the federal government has temporarily stopped the FFRCA, I forget the acronym for it, but it's paid leave if you have to go into isolation or quarantine. Some employers have extended those benefits. Fax is one of those. So even if you're working from home, I still need to know if you're not going to be working, so that I can let you know what benefits you're entitled to. And that's part of the communication.
Great. And we've got time for a few more questions here we'll cover. How do you define residential and commercial background levels as they relate to wildfire events?
That's very... Oh, in terms of air or surface? I mean, air quality, that's pretty hard as well, because again, the pollutants on the AQI are not specific to wildfire only. PM 2.5 is not specific to wildfire only. So there are going to be other sources. Same thing with smoke-related particulate inside homes. There's going to be background levels, because we are not a combustion-free world. We've got industrial sources, we've got, within residential homes, we've got fireplaces, gas stoves. So there's going to be background levels. So that is quite difficult, and it's also dependent on where the property is located. A rural area may have different levels compared to a city area. So it's kind of AQI, you can compare it to the AQI values itself to identify what the levels are in terms of the different categories. But for the smoke-related particulates itself, settled on surfaces, that's highly dependent on the different areas where you're doing your assessments and a whole bunch of other things to consider.
Okay, next question is, any thoughts on best practice regarding air sampling in buildings? Have heard of some sampling for CO versus PM 2.5.
Is this for fires? If this is for wildfires, I would do the PM 2.5 because I agreed carbon monoxide is generated during wildfires. Again, typically that's similar to the gas and vapor, something that's primarily in the proximity of the fire itself and kind of goes up into the atmosphere, where the particulate is something that can come up and move through winds and get into neighboring communities. So I would do the PM 2.5 because that's something that's easily comparable to AQI values, and that's recommended by the air quality management districts and Cal OSHA.
Okay, we'll do one last question here. I am a railroad IH. When we reach 500 AQI and respirators are mandatory, we must medically clear and fit test every worker that needs a respirator. That greatly increases our workload. Do you do medical testing and fit testing also when reaching 500?
Do we at forensic?
I'm assuming so.
Yeah, we would have to. We're already in medical, the technicians or any field employees are all within the respiratory protection program already, because not only do we do wildfire work, we do asbestos, lead, formaldehyde. So we already are, we already have that as a requirement for field employees. And I agree, though, that's a very hard shift to do if you're not an environmental consulting agency, where we already have that, available. So when a wildfire hits, if we have to be in an environment where we need respiratory protection, we're well equipped. So that's why it's important that you're preparing for this. And that's why we're talking about the wildfire preparedness plan and also incorporating the emergencies regulations, because you need to identify, can we limit that to a certain amount of people where we know that we are going to need to go out in the field and or in a location where they're going to have levels greater than 500. So that needs to be so that you are prepared for that, because that's not something that gets done in a day. You have to have that. You have to do the medical evaluation. You have to do the fit testing. You have to have actual written respiratory protection program. And you also have to do a training. So that's something that might take a while. So that has to be considered as soon as you can, so that when it happens, you are prepared for that.
Great. Well, that's going to conclude our question portion in our webinar today. We will be sending out Michelle and Madeleine's contact info, as well as a link to this recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides. So if there were questions that they didn't get to today that you had, please feel free to reach out to them. And we thank you guys for joining us. Thank you, Madeleine and Michelle, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.